A shy nurse used sign language to greet the millionaire's deaf mother, completely unaware that her son, the CEO, was falling head over heels for her. The staff at Whitstone Haven were unusually busy that morning. The high-end care facility, nestled in the serene Vermont hills, was usually known for its calm routines, tranquil gardens, and meticulous attention to detail. However, a hushed urgency permeated the air that day as they prepared for a new resident. Helen Whitmore, a 65-year-old former university literature professor, had recently been widowed. Following a massive stroke 2 years prior, she was diagnosed as profoundly deaf and was now showing early signs of Alzheimer's, including confusion, forgetfulness, and brief lapses in recognition. But more significantly, Helen Whitmore was the mother of Julian Whitmore, the billionaire tech entrepreneur and CEO of Whitmore Innovations, the same corporation that had invested in and modernized dozens of care facilities across the country, including Whitstone Haven. This wasn't just another patient. This was someone whose arrival brought with it watchful eyes, reputations at stake, and a very long shadow. Julian arrived promptly at 8:30 a.m., stepping out of a sleek black town car. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, his silver tie knotted with immaculate precision. His movements were deliberate, not a hair out of place, not a word wasted. He walked briskly, as though time were a precious commodity he was rapidly running out of. "Dr. Lin," he stated, approaching the attending physician and glancing briefly at the chart in his hand. "I expect full updates every 48 hours, medication adjustments logged, mental assessments weekly. I don't want any surprises." "Yes, sir," the doctor responded, almost bowing slightly. Julian didn't address his mother directly. He stood nearby as her wheelchair was gently wheeled into the lobby, but his attention remained fixed on his mobile phone. His sole acknowledgement of her presence was a brief nod, as if confirming the receipt of a delivery. Helen sat silently, her hands clasped in her lap, her eyes scanning the room without discernible expression. Her hearing aid was switched off, although it wouldn't have made much difference anyway. She was no longer able to process sound in a meaningful way, and she seemed unresponsive to the surrounding commotion. In fact, she appeared tense. One nurse attempted to greet her by raising her voice. "Hello, Mrs. Whitmore." Helen visibly recoiled, her shoulders jerking upwards in fear. She turned her face away and began to tremble. Claire Bennett witnessed the entire scene from just a few feet away. Claire had been working at Whitstone Haven for 3 years. She was a quiet, observant nurse with honey blonde hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck and eyes the color of morning mist. She wasn't one to interrupt or draw attention to herself, but she couldn't simply stand by. Gently, Claire stepped forward. She knelt beside Helen's wheelchair, positioning herself not above or behind her, but at eye level. She moved slowly and calmly, as one might approach a startled bird. Then, without speaking, she raised her hands and began to sign. Simple, deliberate gestures. Her lips moved silently as her fingers formed the words. "My name is Claire. The weather is beautiful today. Would you like tea or juice?" Helen blinked, and her body ceased trembling. She stared at Claire's hands, then at her face, and after a long pause, she nodded. A soft, almost imperceptible smile graced her lips. Julian looked up from his phone, startled. He hadn't seen his mother smile in over a year. Not when he moved her into the temporary apartment, not during rehab, not even at his father's funeral. Yet now, without a single spoken word, she had smiled for a stranger. He stared at Claire, confused and captivated. There was something about her gentle and genuine movements that his world of boardrooms and profit margins couldn't comprehend. He felt a subtle shift within his chest, an unfamiliar sensation. For the first time in years, he found himself at a loss for words. And somewhere deep down, though he would never admit it aloud, Julian Whitmore, a man of data, logic, and control, experienced something he hadn't felt in a very, very long time. Julian returned to Whitstone Haven the very next day. He rationalized his visit by telling himself he needed to ensure the facility was maintaining the highest standards of care. After all, his mother had only just been admitted. It was perfectly logical. Any concerned son would do the same. But deep down, he knew it wasn't solely about standards. It was about her, Claire. There was something compelling about the way she had knelt beside his mother, not to treat or fix, but simply to connect. Something about the softness in her eyes, the peacefulness of her presence, and the unforgettable image of his mother's smile. Helen hadn't smiled like that in years, not since his father's death, not since the stroke, and perhaps not even since Julian had stopped trying to engage with her. Now she was smiling because Claire had offered her tea in sign language. Julian visited again the following day and the day after that. Initially, he maintained his distance. He wandered the corridors, scrutinized staff logs, and discussed security upgrades with the director. However, his gaze invariably drifted towards the common room, the garden bench, or wherever Claire happened to be. And slowly, almost unwillingly, he began to notice the subtle details. Claire didn't merely care for the patients. She attentively observed them. He watched her one morning as she sat beside his mother, gently trimming Helen's fingernails, holding each hand as if it were a precious object. Later, she massaged Helen's palms with lavender oil, whispering something as she worked. Nothing loud or dramatic, just a quiet presence. She signed to Helen as she massaged her hands. "Today is Wednesday." Helen looked confused. Claire signed again, more slowly. "Wednesday." Then Helen attempted to repeat the gesture, her fingers uncertain but determined. Claire beamed, nodded, and gently kissed Helen's knuckles. Julian felt a twist in his chest. That evening, as Claire walked past him near the courtyard, he finally spoke. "Did you learn sign language for work?" he asked casually. She stopped and looked at him. "No," she replied softly. "I learned it for someone I loved. Someone who couldn't say goodbye." Julian was rendered speechless. The days passed, and his visits became a routine. However, Helen's memory didn't follow the same predictable pattern. On some mornings, she recognized Julian and smiled when he entered the room. But on other days, her eyes would glaze over, and she wouldn't seem to recognize him at all. Then one afternoon, it happened. Julian sat beside her in her room, speaking softly about a recipe she used to make. Helen blinked slowly, staring at him as if he were a stranger. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, she asked, "Who are you?" Julian froze. "I'm Julian," he said quickly, trying to steady his breathing. "I'm your son." But her expression remained unchanged. She turned back towards the window. Julian's hands fell to his lap, his throat constricted. He bowed his head and took her hand, holding it tightly. And for the first time in years, he wept silently but deeply, a cry that didn't stem from weakness, but from grief, a grief he had suppressed for far too long. He hadn't cried when his father passed away. He hadn't cried when Helen suffered her stroke. He hadn't cried through countless lonely boardrooms and cold hotel nights. But now, kneeling beside his mother who no longer remembered him, he allowed himself to grieve. He didn't hear the door open, but he felt a hand on his shoulder. Claire stood behind him, offering neither words nor solutions. She simply rested her hand there gently and firmly, as she had done for so many others, as if to say, "I see you. You don't have to bear this burden alone." And for the first time, Julian didn't pull away. Julian sat rigidly in one of the small practice rooms off the main corridor, the kind of space where residents sometimes engaged in crafts or light therapy. This afternoon, it was just him and Claire. The door was closed, sunlight streaming through the blinds in soft stripes. She stood before him, calm and patient, her blonde braid resting over one shoulder. He looked out of place. His tie loosened, his jacket neatly folded on the chair beside him, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Relax," Claire said softly. "It's just you and me here." Julian exhaled and rubbed his palms against his knees. "I feel ridiculous," he admitted. She smiled. "You're not. You're learning to speak in a different way." She raised her hands, moving slowly, each gesture clear and deliberate. "Watch. This means I'm Julian." She repeated the sign, then added, "I'm your son." And finally, crossing her hands over her heart, "I love you." Julian watched her fingers intently, trying to memorize the sequence. "I'm Julian. I'm your son. I love you," he murmured under his breath, attempting to copy her movements. His fingers felt stiff, his movements awkward. He twisted one sign incorrectly and stopped, frowning. Claire chuckled softly and stepped closer. No, like this, she said gently, adjusting his wrist and guiding the shape of his hand with her fingertips. Loosen your fingers here. It's like telling a story with your hands. He tried again, this time moving his lips in sync with his hands, whispering each phrase. I'm Julian. I'm your son. I love you. His voice caught on the final words, and his cheeks flushed with self-consciousness. Claire's smile warmed. Better, she said. You're not just making shapes. You're telling her something you've never told her before. Julian let out a shaky breath. I've thought those words so many times, he said quietly. But saying them out loud, doing this, it feels like more. That's why it matters, she answered. Even if she forgets sometimes, your hands can remind her. And you? He nodded, his eyes downcast. Then I want to do it every day. I don't want to lose this chance. Later that evening, the main common room was filled with gentle sounds. Residents chatting over tea and the faint melody of piano music played by a volunteer in the corner. Staff members moved between the tables, carrying trays. Helen sat near the window, a blanket draped over her knees, her gaze drifting from face to face. Julian approached her slowly. He had been rehearsing all afternoon. He knelt beside her chair, meeting her gaze. Hi, Mom, he said softly. She blinked at him, confusion flickering across her features. Julian took a breath, steadied his hands, and began slowly and carefully, just as Claire had taught him. He signed, I'm Julian. I'm your son. I love you. His lips moved silently along with the gestures, but his eyes remained fixed on hers. The room grew quieter. Conversations softened. The piano notes faded into silence as nearby residents and staff turned to watch. Helen's eyes widened and her lips trembled. Then she reached out, her hand finding his cheek and her thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped. A broken sound escaped her throat. She leaned forward and for the first time in years pulled him into her arms. Julian held her tightly, burying his face in her shoulder, unconcerned with who was watching. His hands shook, but his heart felt full. Across the room, Claire stood with a tray of tea, pausing mid-step. She saw the embrace, saw Julian's shoulders trembling, and a small, proud smile touched her lips. Later, as the crowd dispersed and Helen dozed off, Julian found Claire near the nurse's station. He leaned against the counter, his eyes still damp but steady. I used to think feelings made people weak, he said. I built a life on that belief. Now I'm scared that I've missed too much, that I'll never be able to give back what I took away. Claire set the tray down and looked at him quietly. It's not about how long you were gone, she said. It's about how honest you are when you show up. That's what she'll remember. He studied her, then asked softly, Your mother? Claire's eyes dropped momentarily. She passed away 2 years ago, no long-term insurance. We had to bring her home. She lost her speech in the last year. I learned sign language so I could still tell her I loved her, she inhaled. It was the only way left. Julian's gaze softened. Thank you, he said quietly, for teaching me how to be a better son. From that night on, Julian made it a ritual. Every day he visited, he signed those same 3 phrases. Not out of obligation, but because after years of silence, he finally wanted to tell his mother he loved her, and he wanted her to see it. It started as a routine walk. Julian had framed it that way when he invited Claire. I want to check out the therapy garden, you know, from an operational standpoint. Claire had smiled politely. Of course, Mr. Whitmore. He gave her a look. Julian. She nodded, but didn't repeat the name. They walked through the rear corridor, past sunlit windows and hanging baskets. The therapy garden was still under construction in a quiet courtyard, with raised planters, a few trees, and winding brick paths just beginning to take shape. Julian walked slowly, his hands in his pockets, watching the workers from a distance. Claire walked beside him, silent at first, until he asked, Did you always know you wanted to be a nurse? Claire looked ahead for a moment, then shook her head. No, I was in med school 3 years in. Julian turned to her, his eyebrows raised. Really? She nodded. But then my mom got sick. Stroke. There was no one else to care for her. So, you left? I left, she said simply. I stayed home with her for over a year. After she passed, I didn't go back. I didn't want to wear a white coat and give instructions from a distance. I wanted to be near people, hold their hands, notice the things no one else does. She paused. So, I became a nurse. Julian didn't respond immediately. They walked a little further in silence. Birds chirped in the nearby trees, and the scent of soil hung in the air. Finally, he said, "I haven't hugged my mother in 10 years." Claire glanced sideways at him. He continued, his voice low. "I thought I was being strong. I thought if I stayed focused, stayed successful, it would all somehow make up for the rest." He stopped walking, then looked at her. "You taught me it takes 2 minutes a day. 2 minutes to make someone feel remembered." Claire didn't smile, but her expression softened. They stood in silence for a while, looking out at the garden being built. Something meant to heal others now healing them both in quiet ways. But the quiet didn't last. That evening, Claire overheard 2 other nurses in the break room. They were speaking just softly enough to pretend they weren't trying to be overheard. "She's always with him now. You'd think she was some executive. Maybe she's got plans beyond bedpans." Claire remained silent, simply walking past with a blank expression. But the words resonated deeply. By the next morning, she was noticeably quieter. She avoided Julian's usual coffee visit. When he inquired about Helen's sleep routine, she answered quickly and walked away. Her laughter, which had become more frequent, disappeared. She stopped participating in group activities with the residents, returning instead to behind-the-scenes tasks, charts, supplies, and inventory. Julian noticed. He waited 3 days, then left something on the bench near the East Garden. A small, leather-bound notebook with her name delicately inscribed on the inside cover. Claire found it that afternoon during her break. She opened it slowly. Inside were pages of hand-drawn diagrams, sign language phrases she had taught him, each one carefully inked in blue with her corrections written beside them. Toward the middle was a note. "I started learning because of my mother, but I kept learning because of you." Claire's fingers trembled slightly as she closed the book. She glanced toward the hallway where Julian had just passed, speaking quietly to a staff member. No one else saw the smile that returned to her face, small, fragile, but genuine. He didn't have to say it. She knew it happened without warning. One morning, Julian arrived at Whitstone Haven carrying 2 coffees, one black and one with oat milk, just the way Claire liked it. But when he inquired about her at the front desk, the receptionist hesitated. "She's on leave," she said. "Indefinitely." Julian frowned. "Why? Is she all right?" The woman shrugged apologetically. "She didn't say." A sense of dread settled in his chest. He checked the staff schedule and found it devoid of Claire's name. He called her work voicemail. The usual calm of the halls now felt unsettling, as if the warmth she brought had quietly vanished, taking something essential with it. The first person to exhibit the effects of Claire's absence wasn't Julian, it was Helen. Without Claire's daily routine, the lavender balm, the tea at precisely 4 p.m., the slow morning signing of the day of the week, she grew quiet again, withdrawn, and she stopped smiling. Some days she didn't recognize Julian at all. "She was just a nurse," Julian whispered to himself as he sat at his mother's side, watching her stare out the window. But the words rang hollow. Just a nurse hadn't altered a person's entire emotional compass. Just a nurse hadn't taught a son how to communicate with his mother again after years of silence. Claire was never just anything. Unable to remain still, Julian went to the administrative office and requested to review her file. The manager hesitated initially, but Julian's name and his determined expression persuaded him. In her employment history, he found a brief note. Previous position, ER nurse, St. Mary's General Hospital. Julian's chest constricted. That was the hospital where Sophie, his younger sister, had been treated after her car accident 3 years ago, the night he almost lost her. He barely recalled the details of that night. Only flashes of the wreckage, the call from the police, and the frantic rush to the hospital. But Sophie had survived, and she always reiterated the same thing. "Some girl kept people from moving me. She saved my spine. I never even got her name." Julian sat in his car in the hospital car park, the glow of his laptop screen illuminating his face in the darkness. He had pulled strings to access internal footage from that night. And then he saw it. A girl, blonde, in her early 20s, her hands covered in blood, crouching beside Sophie in the rain. She was instructing others, preventing bystanders from touching her, and keeping Sophie's neck stable. Her voice was calm but commanding. She remained there for nearly 20 minutes until the ambulance arrived. Julian leaned closer, his breath caught in his throat. It was Claire, younger but unmistakably Claire. She was the reason his sister could walk again, the reason his mother hadn't lost a daughter. She had saved his family before he even knew her name. Julian sat in silence for a long time, listening to the hum of the engine, the rain beginning to fall against the windscreen, and the blurry image of her frozen on the screen. And then something inside him broke. His shoulders trembled, and for the first time in years, he wept. Not the quiet, restrained kind of crying, but deep, silent sobs that shook his entire body. He gripped the steering wheel and allowed the tears to fall, whispering to no one, "She's the one who held my family together when I didn't even know how." He had spent years building businesses, commanding boardrooms, and expanding empires, but he hadn't even realized that the most important piece of his life had once been saved by a girl who asked for nothing in return, and now she was gone. The little house sat at the edge of a quiet street, framed by wildflowers and ivy creeping up the porch rails. A wind chime tinkled softly above the doorway. Julian stood there in his pressed shirt and dark slacks, feeling oddly out of place. A potted rosemary bush brushed his knee as he shifted. Glancing once more at the handwritten address on his phone, he knocked. A few seconds later, the door opened, and there she was, Claire. She wore a faded gray t-shirt and jeans, with a gardening glove on one hand and dirt smudged across her wrist. A small gray cat peeked out from behind her legs. She blinked, stunned. "Julian?" He nodded, trying not to let his voice falter. "Hi." She stared at him for another moment, then stepped aside. "You came all the way here?" Julian entered slowly, taking in his surroundings. Shelves lined with worn medical textbooks, a half-finished jigsaw puzzle on the coffee table, and trailing houseplants hanging by the window. The air smelled of mint tea and soil, peaceful and lived in. Claire stood near the kitchen doorway, her arms crossed loosely. "What are you doing here?" she asked gently but directly. "How did you even find me?" Julian exhaled. "I looked through your employment file. I found the hospital, and then I found the video." Claire's eyes narrowed slightly in confusion. "The accident," he said. "My sister, 3 years ago. You were there. You kept people from moving her until the paramedics arrived. You saved her." Claire's face paled. "I didn't know she was your sister. She never knew your name." Julian continued, his voice low. "But I watched that footage over and over. It was you." Claire didn't respond immediately. She sank onto the edge of the armchair, the cat hopping into her lap. Her fingers moved absently over its fur. Julian stepped closer, his voice trembling. "You saved Sophie's life, and then, years later, you saved my mother's soul. And somewhere in between," he paused, swallowing hard, "you saved me, too." Claire looked up, startled. Julian's voice grew quieter. "I used to be proud of how emotionally detached I was. I thought it made me stronger, but I didn't realize I'd become someone who didn't know how to feel anything. Not until I saw the way you cared for my mother and everyone else." Claire's eyes glistened. "I was just doing my job." "No," Julian said firmly. "You were healing people in ways no chart could measure." Tears welled in her eyes. Julian moved closer, then knelt in front of her, resting his arms on the armrest beside her folded hands. "You're not nameless, Claire," he said. "You're the reason my family is still whole, the reason I'm not just another cold man in a suit. You didn't just save my sister, you rescued the person I could have become." Claire let out a shaky breath, her voice breaking. "No one's ever said anything like that to me." Julian smiled gently, his eyes still wet. "Then it's long overdue." She looked down, tears slipping silently across her cheeks. The cat nuzzled against her, purring. Julian reached out and brushed her hand softly. "It's time," he whispered. "Time you got to live. Not as someone forgotten. Not as the quiet girl in the background. But as someone seen, someone remembered. It's time you lived like someone who has a name." Claire didn't answer, not with words. She just leaned forward, and for the first time since they met, she allowed herself to cry, not out of grief, but out of the relief that someone finally saw her. Claire returned to Whitstone Haven on a Monday morning. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting soft gold across the dewy grass and the windows of the East Wing. She walked through the front doors quietly, wearing her usual scrubs and that same calm smile that never asked for attention. But the moment the receptionist saw her, the stillness of the morning shattered. "Claire," someone called out, then another voice from down the hall. "She's back!" Within minutes, staff and residents alike had gathered to greet her. Some offered shy hugs, while others simply smiled and whispered, "Like, thank God." "You?" Or, "We missed you." One elderly woman reached for her hand and simply refused to let go. Claire's eyes shimmered, positively overwhelmed by the warmth she was receiving. She hadn't expected this outpouring of affection, not in the slightest. She had always thought she was just a nurse, doing her job. But now, walking these familiar corridors and rooms, she realized she was, in fact, family to these people. She decided to go and see Helen next. The older woman was sitting in her room, gazing out of the window, softly humming a tune that only she seemed to recall from a bygone era. Her fingers moved over the edge of the blanket on her lap, restless and almost searching for something. Claire took a step forward and knelt down beside her chair. "Hi, Ms. Whitmore." Helen turned slowly, her eyes cloudy and unfocused for a moment. Then they locked on to Claire. A spark of recognition flickered in them. "Claire," she said clearly, a warm smile blooming on her lips. Claire's heart swelled with emotion. "You remember me?" Helen nodded, reaching out for her hand. "You're the girl who makes me laugh." Claire squeezed her fingers gently, her throat tight with emotion. "It's good to see you again." From the doorway, Julian stood silently watching this heartfelt exchange. His mother hadn't even remembered his name just 2 days prior, but she remembered Claire without hesitation. And somehow, surprisingly, it didn't hurt him. It felt right somehow. A few days later, Whitstone Haven held its annual staff appreciation ceremony. A modest affair with tea, biscuits, paper lanterns strung delicately across the ceiling, and a dozen or so folding chairs lined up beneath a hand-painted banner that read, "To those who care with heart and hands." Staff gathered in their uniforms, and the residents sat eagerly in the front row, clapping politely as names were read out and certificates were handed over with a warm smile. It was a genuinely warm event, filled with small but significant moments of kindness and gratitude. Julian had been invited to speak last. He walked confidently to the small podium, wearing a soft gray blazer instead of his usual dark corporate suits. The microphone squeaked slightly as he adjusted it to his height. He looked out across the room, his eyes carefully scanning the familiar faces. His mother sat near the front, her eyes distant but with a look of contentment on her face. Claire stood near the back wall, her hands clasped gently, as quiet and unassuming as ever. "I've spent most of my life thinking silence was something to avoid at all costs," Julian began, his voice resonating in the room. "In business, in relationships, even in grief, I believed silence was a failure to act, a sign of weakness, a space that needed to be filled with words." He paused for a moment, allowing his words to settle in the minds of his audience. "But then I met someone who taught me that silence, when used with love and intention, can be a powerful language of its own. A bridge, not a void." His gaze drifted towards Claire at the back of the room. She didn't raise her voice to be heard. She didn't demand recognition or praise, but she changed everything for the better. Julian stepped down from the podium and walked slowly over to his mother. The room fell completely silent, all eyes on him. He knelt down beside her, gently took her hand in his, and carefully signed, "I love you, Mom." Helen blinked, her lips trembling slightly with emotion. Her fingers moved slowly, uncertainly at first, then with more confidence as she returned the sign, "I love you too." Gasps and quiet murmurs of emotion echoed around the room. A nurse wiped away a tear from her eye. One of the residents clapped softly, and then Helen leaned forward without hesitation and wrapped her arms tightly around her son. A full embrace, firm and true, the kind of heartfelt embrace they hadn't shared in over a decade. Julian hugged her back just as tightly, closing his eyes as he held her close. At the back of the room, Claire watched this touching scene unfold. tears silently slipping down her cheeks. She didn't move from her spot. She didn't need to. Her smile was quiet and peaceful, her heart overflowing with happiness. She had, in her own way, given them back to each other, not with grand gestures or empty words, but with her simple presence and unwavering care. And as the room erupted in applause, one thing was abundantly clear to everyone present. Sometimes, the loudest and most profound love comes from the quietest of hands. The garden came to life slowly, just like everything that is truly meaningful and worthwhile in life. It started with a simple yet profound idea. Julian wanted to create something lasting, something tangible that gave back to the place that had given him and his mother so much comfort and support. Claire, on the other hand, wanted to create a space where communication could happen without pressure or expectation, a place where hands could speak eloquently when voices could not. Together, with shared vision and purpose, they brought it into being. They decided to call it the Garden of Hands. Built in the courtyard behind Whitstone Haven, it was a peaceful and serene haven, bathed in warm sunlight and gentle breezes. Raised beds overflowed with the fragrant scents of rosemary, lavender, and delicate forget-me-nots. There were beautifully crafted benches placed strategically beneath the shade of small, carefully chosen trees. Each bench engraved with a word in both written English and American Sign Language. Peace, hope, remember. Staff and dedicated volunteers began holding regular workshops there, teaching simple sign language to both residents and their families. Alzheimer's patients learned how to express simple needs like pain or thank you with their hands when their spoken words became lost or inaccessible. Hearing residents practiced introducing themselves to their deaf neighbors, forging new connections and understanding. For some, it was the very first time they had truly connected with one another in years, breaking down barriers and fostering a sense of community. Helen absolutely adored the garden. Though her memory flickered and faded like an old film reel, she found a deep sense of comfort and security in the predictable routines and familiar surroundings. Some days she recognized Julian instantly, other days she did not recognize him at all. But she always recognized Claire without fail. "You're the girl who makes me laugh," she would say with a beaming smile, gently tapping Claire's cheek with her finger. Claire never corrected her or tried to remind her of who she was. She simply smiled back warmly and signed, "I'm happy to see you too." One golden afternoon, Julian found Claire sitting peacefully beneath the magnificent red maple in the far corner of the garden, the very same tree that she had admired since the first day it was planted. The leaves above her head glowed a deep amber color in the soft, dappled sunlight. A gentle breeze rustled through the branches, sending a few leaves fluttering gracefully down to the earth around her feet. He approached her quietly and respectfully. No clipboard in hand, no rehearsed speech prepared. He didn't sit down beside her. He didn't speak a single word. He simply stood before her, his eyes searching hers intently, conveying a depth of emotion that words could never capture. Then slowly and deliberately, his hands began to move, forming the familiar shapes of sign language. The signs were simple, perhaps a little shaky with nerves, but perfectly clear in their meaning. "Will you marry me?" Claire froze, completely taken aback by this unexpected proposal. For a few seconds, she was utterly speechless, unable to find the words to respond. Her hands lifted instinctively to her lips, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and disbelief. Then, all at once, her expression softened, and her face melted into a radiant laugh, one of those infectious laughs that breaks open joy from deep within the soul. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she stood up and walked straight into his waiting arms, embracing him tightly. She didn't sign. She didn't speak. She simply held him close, savoring the moment. After a long and tender moment, she pulled back slightly, looked up at him, her eyes shining with happiness, and whispered softly, "I heard you." Then softly, almost like a sacred promise, she added, "I hear you now, and I always will." No more words were needed between them. Not here, in this peaceful garden, not ever again. Because sometimes, the most important things in life aren't shouted from the rooftops. They're signed with love. They're felt deeply in the heart. And they're held securely between two souls that remember and hands that never forget. If this story has touched your heart, brought a smile to your face, or even brought a tear to your eye, just imagine how many more beautiful and untold stories are waiting to be discovered and shared with the world. At Soul Stirring Stories, we believe passionately in the quiet power of love, resilience, in the face of adversity, and the small, seemingly insignificant acts of kindness that can change lives forever. If you felt something real and profound today, please consider subscribing to our channel and don't forget to hit that like button to show your support. Your love and encouragement help us to continue bringing you more stories that heal, inspire, and remind us all of what truly matters in this world. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you in the next story, where hearts speak even louder than words.